Hi, everybody. I want to talk about multiplying fractions. Now, when I was in school, I learned this way to multiply, something like 3.5 times 2. They said to us, you want to change this 3.5 into, let's see, you multiply 3 times 2 and you add the 1 and you get 7 over 2. And then you change the 2 into 2 over 1. They didn't explain a lot about why 3.5 was 7 over 2. This was just the way you do it. And then you say, okay, 7, the 2's here can cancel out, the 2 on top and the 2 on the bottom. And you're left with 7 over 1, which is equal to 7. Whoops. Now, the trouble with that is it doesn't make any sense. So what I want to do in this video is talk about how intuitively you can teach even kind of young, like third grade kids, how to multiply 3.5 times 2, and even how to do 3.5 times 2.5. Most kids can figure out what 3.5 objects would look like, right? So there's 3.5 stars, but kids could do 3.5 cookies, right? Now imagine that instead of one set of 3.5 stars or one set of 3.5 cookies, you had two of them. Most kids can now say, okay, I have 1, 2, 3 here and another 3 here, that's 6. And then I have these 2 half stars or half cookies. So I now have 6 plus a half plus another half. And so now I have 7. And that seems to me such a much better way to intuitively grasp that 3.5 times 2 is 7. Grown-ups do this all the time. If you have $3.50 and then you add another $3.50 to that, you have $7. So we do think intuitively about fractions. Now, let's talk about how we can extend that intuitive idea of fractions to 3.5 times 2.5. So now we have to imagine that instead of 2 rows of stars, we have 2.5 rows of stars. Well, here I've placed 3 rows of stars. So I have 3.5, 3.5, 3.5. This is 3.5 times 3. It's not 3.5 times 2.5. Instead of 1, 2, 3 rows here, I want 2.5 rows going down. So what I can do to do that is block off half of this last row. And then I'm going to have 3.5 by 2.5. So now I've blocked off this last half of a row, right? And I have 1, 2.5 rows. So I have 1, 2, 3.5 stars times 2.5 rows. Now let's count how many stars we have. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 whole stars. Here I see 2 half stars. And here's 3 half stars. And in the corner, that's a quarter of a star. So you can kind of figure out the answer from there without actually using any multiplication. This is just an intuitive idea of what 3.5 times 2.5 is that a kid could use instead of all that nonsense of getting a common denominator and, of getting mixed improper fractions, changing from mixed numbers to improper fractions that we learned in school. So let's talk about these numbers and how we could get them up here and how they relate to our picture. What we can do is we can break the 3.5 and the 2.5 up into their whole number and their fraction parts. So 3.5 is 3 plus a half, and 2.5 is 2 plus a half. Then what we can do is we can do 3 times 2, and that's 6. You can see the 6 whole stars right here. So that's one of our partial products. Then we can do the 3 times the 1/2 here. So 3 times 1/2 is, if you remember how to multiply fractions, it's 3 times the 1. And imagine 3 is 3 over 1. 1 times the 2. We get 3 over 2. But if you just multiplied 3 times a half and you couldn't figure that out, just think, how much is 3 halves? 3 halves is 1 half, 2 halves, 3 halves. 3 times a half is 3 halves. So you can think of it that way, and that's more intuitive. Then we do half times 2, or half of 2. Half of 2 is 1, or 2 over 2. You can add 1 there. And then a half times a half. Half of a half is a quarter. Oops. 1 plus 1/4. There we go. And here we have all of our partial products, and they're all in here. Here's the 6 wholes. The 3 halves are right here. 1, 2, 3 half stars. The 1 is here. Our 2 half stars are 1, and the quarter is down here in the corner. Now we can also translate this into an area model where our area is a 3.5 by 2.5 rectangle. So here's our 3.5, so 3 whole squares plus a half a square here, by 2.5 rectangle. 2 whole squares, and this is a half square going down. And the same partial products show up here. Here's our 6 whole squares. Here's our 2 half squares, our 3 half squares, and our little quarter at the bottom. Some of you might want to just pause the video to read this a little bit, this partial product breakdown, and make sure you understand all the multiplied parts in here. But the most important part for you as a teacher is to understand 3.5 by 2.5 and how that ends us up with this little quarter piece over here, just like this little quarter piece of a star we had in our previous picture. Same idea. So now some of you might have trouble, if you're just given a rectangle like this, to draw a problem out on your own. So let's talk about that next. Suppose I wanted to draw a 6.5 by 4.5 rectangle and then find my partial products. Well, that means I would want 6 whole squares and going across or down, but I'm just going to pick to go across first. And then I would want a little half square at the end. So 6 whole squares going across and then a little half square at the end. And I would want to do 4 whole squares going down with a little half square at the end of it and draw a rectangle to connect those sides. So let's give that a try. First of all, if I want to go 6 across, you might think I was going to count 1 square here, 2 squares here, 3, 4, no. We need to split this up so that we have half squares. So let's take a second to split our squares up so that we could show half squares better. What I've done here is I've divided these boxes up. So I'm going to call this one whole one, and it's divided up into 2 halves, right? And then this is another one. This is my second going across, and this is my third divided up into 2 halves, right? 4. And then this is 5, and then this is 6. So if I went 6.5, that means that I'm going to end my box right here on this line. So I'll make a line right at 6.5. So my line is going to go down like this. And so that's my halfway mark. Let's make that just a little darker so that you can see it. And that's my half a box. And then I need to do the same thing going down. So this is 6.5 across. And now I need to measure out 4.5 going down. So now here we have 1, 2, 3, 4 whole boxes going down. And I want to make 4.5 boxes going down. So this would be half a box here. So I'm going to make my new red line go on that 4.5 box. And so I'm going to box off my box like this. And this inside here, this is a 6.5 by 4.5 box. And now you can find all your partial products. So you can change this to 6 plus a half. And you can change the next one to 4 plus a half. And what are all the partial products? Well, you've got your 6 by 4 part, that's 24. You've got your 6, let's do 6 times a half next. So 6 times a half, that's 6 over 2, or a half of 6, that's 3. So that means somewhere in here we have 3 whole squares. Where are they? Let's see. Here's a half, here's a half, here's a half, here's a half. How many half squares do we have along here? We have 6 of them. So 6 half squares, that's 3 whole squares. And then we do a half times 4. A half of 4 is 2. So here we have half square and another half square and another half square and a half square. That's 4 half squares, that's 2. And we finish off with our little 1/4 square at the bottom. Now, what if I wanted to do like 6 1/3 times 4 1/2, something like that? Well, then I'd have to divide this up not into halves, but into thirds as well, right? And I would have to divide this up into whatever. You got to change the way you split up the boxes, right? And so I want you to play around with that yourselves on your own. But it's not too hard, and if you start getting a little confused by the area part of this, go back to the stars and think, okay, 6 1/3 instead of 6 1/2, 6 1/3 stars, what would that look like going across? And then what would it look like going down? And have fun with it.